In the previous video, we looked at an aviation accident which occurred on a runway due to obstructions, at night, in low visibility. In that accident, the flight crew attempted to depart by taking off from a runway which had been obstructed by construction equipment. In this video, we will examine another ground-related aviation accident, which largely has been lost to time with little written about the incident. Also occurring on a runway, where this incident differs from the previously discussed accident, is that this runway was clear, and it was a relatively fine day for flying. Cubana Flight 389, while rolling down the runway at Quito, Ecuador, simply failed to lift off of the ground. Some surviving passengers recanting their version of events, saying the plane only ever gained a few meters of altitude before crashing. Just what happened here? As previously mentioned, this accident has had only little written about it. However, using the publicly available sources that are available, we can construct a timeline of events which led to disaster. Cubana de Aviación is the national state-owned airline of Cuba. While the airline's history dates all the way back to the 1920s, it took on a whole different shape in the late 1950s following the Cuban Revolution. Multiple privately owned airlines were merged into Cubana, to which the airline remains state-owned to this day. In the 1970s, the airline began taking delivery of a new type of aircraft, the Soviet-built Tupolev 154. Developed in the late 1960s, the Tupolev 154 began taking to the skies with airlines in 1972, being introduced with Aeroflot. The Tupolev 154 would become one of the most popular passenger planes to come out of the Soviet Union, with over 1,000 planes of the type built. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s, the Tupolev 154 remained as one of the most popular planes in the world, especially in Eastern Europe, where the type operated well into the 2000s with numerous airlines. Because of political ties between Russia and Cuba, the plane also found itself in the Caribbean flying for Cubana. It was not the only Soviet-era plane to make its way to the island, however, as the 4-engine Ilyushin IL-62 also operated as part of the Cubana fleet. As for the Tupolev 154 that was involved in the accident at Quito, it was the more modern variant of the plane, the 154M. The plane could carry up to 180 passengers, with a range of just over 3,500 miles. The 3-engine design is highly reminiscent of Boeing's own 727 series of planes, which launched in the United States 8 years prior to the Soviet Tupolev. The accident plane was delivered to Cubana in 1986. However, records indicate that the plane was transferred out in 1992 to another airline called Abkan Avia. Based out of Moscow, this was one of many privately owned airlines that sprang up after the collapse of the Soviet-era Aeroflot. It was later delivered back to Cubana. The accident topic for this video occurred on August 29, 1998. Cubana Flight 389 would be the return service back to Havana, Cuba, with a stopover in the Ecuadorian port city of Guayaquil. It was on the takeoff of this short domestic leg that the accident would occur. This would normally be the section of the video where we would break down the members of the flight crew. However, on this occasion, a reliable source could not be found to identify the flight crew. The Tupolev 154 as a series of aircraft can consist of a flight crew of anywhere between 3 to 5 members. As standard, there are seats for a captain and first officer. A flight engineer is also required on the 154. On older models of the aircraft, a 4th member can act as a navigator. There was also one more space for a potential second officer. The flight engineer on this plane is stationed with a large panel so they can manage many of the aircraft systems. The panel is intimidating even by flight engineer panel standards, and even comes with throttle controls. In the afternoon on this August day, the flight crew had been preparing for departure from their gate in Quito. Clearance had been given, and the pilot set about getting the plane's engine started. On this occasion, the left side number 1 engine was to be powered on first. The flight engineer must go through multiple steps to configure this engine for startup, not least of which is to provide the engine with the necessary air supply. The number 1 engine, however, would not start. It became apparent that a pneumatic valve had faulted, which delayed the engine startup and takeoff. Once the air pneumatic system was looked at, The problem was rectified after a 38-minute delay, and the engines could now be started up. Again, the left side number 1 engine was powered up, this time with no reported problems and with the help of ground power. The center tail-mounted number 2 engine was then also started. The last remaining engine was to be powered up during the taxi out to the runway. Surviving passengers would later unanimously agree that they suspected problems with the plane's engines. The old international airport at Quito features a runway with a length of just over 3 kilometers. The airport itself sits at an elevation of 2,850 meters above sea level. Aircraft taken off at airports with high elevation require a longer takeoff run to compensate for thinner air. The airport is surrounded by urbanization, not an uncommon feature of many airports in Latin America. Flight 389 on this day taxied out to runway 17 for a southerly departure. By the time the Tupolev plane reached the end of the runway, the third engine was started and the plane was configured for takeoff. The pilots would have gone through several checklists to make sure the plane was of a satisfactory state to fly. Included on these checklists were hydraulic systems checks. On this Soviet-built plane, the Tupolev 154, hydraulic systems need to be adjusted and charged, and then hydraulic switches which control valves in the control surfaces need to be appropriately set. Otherwise, the aircraft flight control services would not function as needed. These included the ailerons, rudder, and elevator. This hydraulic system is of particular interest, and we will come back to it soon. Now at runway 17 at Quito Airport, Cubana Flight 389 would begin what would be the first of 3 attempts at departure. After rolling down the runway for some time, the takeoff was rejected. It is unclear as to why the takeoff was aborted, but this furthered speculation among surviving passengers of a potential engine fault. The Tupolev plane was taxied back out to runway 17 to attempt a second departure attempt, which again resulted in a rejected takeoff. After vacating the runway again for a second time, the plane would try takeoff for a third time. After receiving their clearance again for takeoff on runway 17, Flight 389 began rolling down the runway. However, before we discuss what happened on the runway next, we need to back up and understand that at some point between leaving the gate and this third takeoff attempt, a certain checklist was not performed correctly. It became apparent to investigators that the flight crew did not appropriately set the control surface's hydraulic systems. We know from what happened next that the elevator control's hydraulics were not set to function, but without an accident report and lack of more in-depth sources, we cannot fully determine if other hydraulic systems had also been missed. These hydraulic checks were noted in the aircraft's taxi checklist. It is believed, with the multiple delays on the ground, the flight crew simply forgot to execute this check. It is also presumed that on their checklist, this was the last point of note on the taxi checklist. As Flight 389 accelerated past the V1 speed, the takeoff appeared normal. V1 speed often being considered to be the speed at which pilots are committed to takeoff. This speed was quickly followed by the rotation speed, where the plane was supposed to be angled into the air. Because the hydraulics for at least the elevator controls had not been activated, the plane did not respond when the pilots pulled back on their control columns. The plane simply continued to accelerate down the runway with the nose still on the ground. As the runway here was over 3 kilometers in length, there was still a significant amount of time before the plane would reach the end of the runway. However, it would take the flight crew around 10 seconds after realizing the elevator controls were not functioning to call for the takeoff to once again be abandoned. Calling for a takeoff to be aborted past V1 is not normal, but by the time that the flight crew did eventually make this decision, there was only around 800 meters of runway left, not nearly enough runway for the plane to come to a stop. According to accounts by surviving passengers, the pilots attempted to slow the plane down by applying maximum possible braking. However, at just after 1 p.m. local time, the Tupolev plane broke through the airport boundaries and fencing. After passing over a busy roadway and narrowly avoiding a large residential area, Cubana Flight 389 crashed into a nearby football field, of which several children were occupying at the time. The crash had severely damaged 2 houses and an auto mechanic shop, killing 10 people on the ground, including 5 children on the football field. An undisclosed amount of passerbys and local residents were also injured. On board the plane, 70 of the 91 occupants were killed, including all members of the flight crew. Some sources indicate that multiple other children had also went missing during the aftermath of the crash. Several explosions were later heard at the crash site. Cuban media, upon receiving news of the crash, did not broadcast news of the event until the evening, several hours later. Following the crash, airport operations at Quito temporarily ceased, with the location of the airport close to heavily populated areas being widely criticized. It was not the first time an accident like this occurred at Quito. In 1984, a Douglas DC-8 crashed in similar circumstances, in that the plane failed to gain altitude during takeoff. Once overshooting the runway, the subsequent crash killed over 50 people, many being ground fatalities. The Ecuadorian president, upon visiting the crash site, ordered a full investigation into the accident. While an accident report was either not published or unavailable to the public at the time of research of this video, it was disclosed that it was concluded that pilot error with regards to not appropriately configuring their plane for flight was a primary causal factor to the crash. A new airport was to be constructed at Quito, away from the city and away from populated areas. The new airport opened in 2013. The state-owned Cuban airline Cubana continues to operate to this day, although the Tupolev 154 has long since been retired from the fleet. As of 2021, the Tupolev 154 now primarily only serves as a military aircraft. The North Korean airline Air Koryo now serves as the last operator of the plane for passenger service. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this video to be interesting, be sure to subscribe for a new video every Saturday. As I could not find an ideal source for the flight crew for this video, I will leave this open for viewer input. If you happen to have any info about this and have a citation as well, be sure to leave a comment and I may attach this info in a pinned comment in the future. Anyway, it is time to thank my patrons for their continuous support, some of whom who have been around for the past 6 months. Thank you all so much. A thank you to my £5 tier patrons, Aidan Montgomery, Derek Bean, Hector Palmateles, Ian Tatum, Jacopo, Ken Zachman, Christy, Leon San Jennings, Marie Innes, MG, Pacman7, Panic Chicken, Surya Melody, SoFP, and Sue's Shoes. A special thanks to my generous £10 patrons for their continued support, Alex Keller, who updated their patronage recently, thank you so much, new joiner Ann Sid, Daniel Hendricks, D. Rogers, Flaming Hot Cheetos, Mike Milton, Side Effect, Robert Hamilton, Roger Mayer, and Where Are My Cheetos? Thank you all so much. That is it from me this week. Have a great weekend, and I will see you next week. Goodbye.